Our next session is a hotly contested political debate. We're lucky enough to have Shannon Halbert, MP, and his lucky green tie, and Chris Bishop, MP, for joining us today. Fran O'Sullivan, Editorial Director of Business at NZME, will facilitate the conversation. Fran is a leading business commentator who writes a regular column in the New Zealand Herald and appears frequently on current affair TV shows. As executive editor of the Herald's business reports, she launched an infrastructure report in the Herald more than a decade ago. The report is published annually to coincide with Infrastructure New Zealand's Building Nations Conference. Looking forward to seeing how you're going to steer this political debate, Fran.
Thank you very much. Gosh, 4 months to the election and quite a lot to talk about, and I hope you're getting your questions ready. I'm really delighted the two panellists we have today, Chris Bishop, National Party, spokesman on housing and infrastructure currently and also for RMA reform, but has previously held the transport shadow portfolio. And also Shannon Halbert, who has stepped up in Michael Wood's place. Shannon, a big interest also in infrastructure. He campaigned for the Northcote seat, advocating for a second harbour crossing, and he won that seat. But more particular to this debate, he chairs Parliament's Select Committee on Infrastructure and Transport. Please welcome our two speakers. Thank you. Thank you very much. I promised them they could each have 3 or 4 minutes uninterrupted to talk to you a little bit about priorities heading into the election, and it is only a short time away, but as we've been reminded by major party leaders and so forth this morning, they're thinking in 30-year timeframes, not in 4 months, but I know which one is most important to you right now. So I'd like to first throw to you, Shannon, wearing the government hat, but also I think because you come having that wide breadth across, the portfolios, both portfolios, infrastructure and housing, from a broader perspective than just the narrow party perspective. I think you've got a difficult balancing act, but anyway, away you go.
Kia ora, everyone, and thanks very much, Fran, for having me this afternoon. I'm very lucky to have first-hand experience, and I guess what is centre to so much of the infrastructure story that we tell in New Zealand, and certainly I talk up the Northcote story and our housing story in particular. When it comes to transport and in the work chairing the Transport and Infrastructure Select Committee, I mean, we have key focus areas around how do we decongest our roads, how do we reduce our emissions, and in fact, when we look at 43% of our emissions come from our transport sector, that's the one contributing thing that each of us can do in New Zealand to address, make our commitment to climate change. And so when it comes to our transport story in Auckland, we know we need a lined up integrated transport system. Part of that is Auckland Light Rail, part of that is CRL, and of course, passionately, the other part for me is around the Waitemata Harbour crossing, which people desperately need. But the reality in Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland, of course, is that we're growing quite quickly. And for North Shore people in Auckland, my home patch, we're going to have another Hamilton placed on us in the next 10 to 20 years. And so within that, we know that our infrastructure hasn't been invested in over previous decades. We've got to do that now. We've seen the largest investment ever across the infrastructure sector. But the other part of that, we've got to work in a bipartisan way to ensure that the industry has certainty to achieve the projects that we want to, and that most of all, we set up a transport infrastructure system for future generations.
That was one of the things that was commented on by Chris Luxon this morning, the importance also of bipartisanship, and we'll come back to that later. But anyway, the floor is yours, Chris Bishop.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Fran, and thanks everyone for coming along, and thanks to the sponsors for making this event possible. This morning, many of you will have heard Christopher Luxon outline a 5-point plan to boost infrastructure investment in New Zealand. It's think well known that we've got a deficit. The quantum varies anywhere between 150 and $200 billion. It's there, we've got to address it. And we've outlined a plan to do that. The first is a national infrastructure agency, which builds on the work of Crown Infrastructure Partners. They did all the work on the ultra-fast broadband, rolled it out on time and under budget. We want to supercharge that agency and make it a centre of expertise for procurement and also innovative funding and financing tools to boost infrastructure investment. Because the reality is the Crown can't do it all by itself. Central government doesn't have the balance sheet to do that. We need to use private sector capital and private sector expertise. And we are open to things like value capture, for example, which I know the government is doing some work on. And I suppose we're pushing the boat out a bit further and saying we want to use it for projects like new state highways that unlock new housing opportunities, for example, where the gains from the public investment are captured by private landowners. Our view is that they should make a contribution to the cost of that infrastructure, having gained from that. And I know many in the room will be familiar with the example of Crossrail in the UK and other projects around the world. So our view is we've been too slow on the uptake of using those sort of tools, and the time has come in New Zealand to use them. We do want to develop city and regional deals, which is a framework to reset the relationship between central and local government. And if we're honest with ourselves, the Auckland Transport Alignment Program is an example, a sort of prototype of how that works, where you've got Auckland Transport on behalf of Auckland and central government with a 10-year program of work, and then a bit more work on the next 10 years beyond that, but an agreed program of investment. We want to use that in other regions as well. And the critical thing we do need to address is the consenting framework. Work by the Infrastructure Commission and also by Infrastructure New Zealand, this organisation, you will all know that the consenting framework just is broken. It holds us back. Hundreds of millions of dollars spent in time and money on that. So we've proposed a fast-track consent process picking up on the COVID fast-track process, but also a major priorities process for major infrastructure works for complex projects where it's going to take a bit of time, but we do need to get that down to 1 year. And then that 30-year plan, Fran, that Christopher talked about, which I know people often talk about, let's build out the 30-year plan of work so that we have some certainty and industry knows where it's going, and develop a pipeline for the future. So those are the 5 things that Christopher talked about this morning. The only thing I'd say in terms of specifically on transport, and send the apologies of our spokesperson, Simeon Brown, who's become a father for the 3rd time just 2 days ago. So I hope you'll forgive him for that. But the only other thing I'd say about transport specifically is road pricing is going to be critical in the next few years, proper road pricing. This idea that we can continue to use fuel tax as a proxy for road usage is broken now, and it's only going to get worse in the next few years. My wife and I both drive electric cars. We pay nothing to use the roads. Sadly, lower income people who drive fuel inefficient cars pay through the nose to use the roads. So the system is regressive, and it doesn't allow for dynamic pricing and congestion pricing. And so proper road pricing, I'm not being particularly party political here, doesn't matter which government's in charge of whatever stripe, green or red or blue or whatever. I'm picking up on your tie. Yeah. It doesn't matter what government's in charge. We're going to have to address that.
Oh, come on. I think you're going to have a go here now.
I think
about the tie, at least.
the green tie to capture attention, but that's the most important thing in transport, is that we're cleaning up our fleet. What Bush talks about, of course, is some of it's quite right, and that's the reason why we need to invest in proper lined up infrastructure to help people get around at a cost that they can afford to get around in. I think the infrastructure plan that they presented, it's only been a few hours since I've had a glance over it. They've put it out there. It's not too dissimilar to actually what we're already doing, and our government remains open to tweaking some things, just like we are open to tweaking some things on enabling houses, of course. But the key thing is we've got to work on this stuff together, because we need to accelerate the build to enhance our overall transport infrastructure system. That includes roads, of course. Under our government, we've increased road maintenance fund by 50% while they cut it. But it's not just roads. We need multiple modes of transport for people to get around, no matter which region that you're living in.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say we've been talking about 30-year plans for, well, not quite 30 years, but certainly for the best part of 10 years. And that obviously the infrastructure commission, setting up pipelines and so forth. I mean, you've each staked out particular areas, which it seems to me aren't that too much different. Just looking at each other's plans and positions, I mean, where is the commonality and how do you bridge the differences between these two parties so we actually do get something which everyone can build off, which we don't have at the moment?
I talked about an example that I think is a really good example that we can work on in the Waitemata Harbour Crossing. I've likened the fact actually that there's been less politics in the early stages of discussion than the likes of Auckland Light Rail.
Yeah.
And that tells me actually somewhere in there is general agreement. I campaigned on it, the Nats campaigned on it in the last election because people in Auckland know that it needs to happen. The part that I think we'll get political on and we'll debate is around the cost and the economic benefits of it and how do we measure that, which is always a difficult thing when we discuss transport investment. So that particular project I think is a really good one for us both to get on board, to get around the table and talk about how do we achieve that. I understand that extension or invitation has gone to the National Party and I'm looking forward to working with them on it.
Will National accept the invitation?
Yeah, I mean, look, we are completely open to bipartisanship on projects like the Second Harbour Crossing. It's a critical project for New Zealand's future. We campaigned on it in 2020.
But will you actually get around the table and accept the invitation to discuss?
I mean, I think we have. I think that work's underway. I mean, the process has just started. That's actually not true. The process of the next Second Harbour Crossing goes all the way back to 2014 or maybe even 13 when John Key said we're going to build it. So this work's been underway for a large number of years now, and of course it takes time to get these things right. But yeah, I mean, I think we're up for that. I think there's a degree actually of commonality about what Auckland needs. If we're talking Auckland in particular, the motorway network is now complete in Auckland. I would say we need to build the East-West link. I suspect Shannon probably disagrees, but with the exception of the East-West link, which is a critical freight enabler, the motorway network is complete. That the challenge in Auckland is City Rail Link, and that's why we started it, and it's going to complete in the next couple of years. I can't wait till it opens. It's going to be fantastic. But other than that, it's building high-quality rapid transit in Auckland. We can have a debate about whether or not light rail is the right solution for that. Sadly, that the politics of light rail have become very tricky because it's not actually a light rail project anymore, by the way. It's misnamed. So I think that's actually problematic because it's now a metro. It started life as a $300 million tram down Dominion Road.
That's right.
That's how it started life. It was an Auckland Transport local project to sort Dominion Road bus congestion. And people have their own different views about that. It's now turned into a hugely expensive metro to the airport. And it's misnamed. So the politics have become very tricky around Auckland Light Rail. But the need for a solution to congestion in Auckland hasn't gone away.
One of the areas where I think we have and are working on a bipartisan approach, Bush talked about, was congestion pricing. So through the select committee process, we ran quite a robust inquiry that looked internationally at some of the models that were in place. We debated that in the House, and sure enough, it is something that all parties want to proceed with. I think just going back to Auckland Light Rail, that what that has morphed into, and appreciate the light rail versus metro example, is that it has morphed into a lined up integrated transport network that isn't just Auckland Light Rail, it's the CRL, Waitemata Harbour Crossing and light rail over to the shore. And so if we're going to be bold and visionary and actually set ourselves up as a global city like we want to be, one that is productive and that one that where people can flourish, that, we need to be that bold and we need to plan around that level.
Yeah, look, I don't disagree on the aspiration. I guess where we would disagree is the cost is just so expensive. And, look, the figure of 30 billion's batted around. Actually, there's operational costs on top of that. That's just the $30 billion capex to build it. That goes a long way in terms of better buses generally, but also busways, which are cheaper and move a lot of people. I always use the example of the Northern Busway across the bridge, the most successful transport project in New Zealand history. $100 million in the early 2000s. 40% of people now cross the Harbour Bridge in a bus. The most successful transport project in terms of benefit cost ratio in New Zealand history. So you can do a lot with buses and busways, and you can also do a lot with the City Rail Link, which we've just spent a large amount of money, both from a local government point of view and a central government point of view, building. And, I think of very valuable projects like the Fourth Main in Auckland, which we should be doing at the same time as doing the third. I think of the electrification further down the line to Hamilton, Pokeno, Tuakau, further on in time. I think of the enormous growth happening out in the northwest of Auckland, where there's a lot of greenfields growth, and they are massively underserved because of infrastructure. I would argue a lot of those projects would be further up the value chain than Auckland Light Rail, which is not to say we don't need a solution around congestion in Auckland, and we do need to build a high quality rapid transit network. But, we're just very sceptical that $30 billion, or more is worth it.
Just to clarify, I mean, as I understand it, Auckland Light Rail Limited is in the process of getting close to consenting and naming for the stations and routes for Auckland Light Rail. If that's in place ahead of the election and National did get to form the next government, would you still exit Auckland Light Rail?
We'll have more to say about our specific Auckland and other cities' transport policies.
In the past, however, National has suggested it would can Auckland Light Rail.
Well, we are opposed to Auckland Light Rail. That is the position. And I've just expressed a bunch of reasons why we're opposed to it. And, we will announce our policies closer to the election.
One of the difficulties in election year, of course, and I've heard very clearly from the sector today is that they want us to work together. They want some certainty. And sadly, elections aren't designed to achieve that. It's designed for both of us to present different ideas. But I think there are common projects. And just to extend beyond Tāmaki Makaurau, Auckland, of course, as we've just finished a collaborative piece of work around interregional passenger rail that has sought submissions across New Zealand. People are very passionate about interregional passenger rail. The example for us is that we kick-started with Te Huia, but like an extension down to Tauranga around that Golden Triangle, the Wellington back to Palmerston North, Christchurch to Picton. So, those are some of the future items that I think that we can continue to discuss and agree on the idea that it's a good thing. Where we get caught up politically is around the cost, and we may measure the cost and benefit ratios differently between parties. When I look at Auckland Light Rail, the impact that it's going to make on South Auckland, the productivity and the jobs that it creates, second to none.
Where you go.
I sort of just can't. I mean, it's all a bit of a love-in on stage, which is great. Shannon's a good guy. We get on well. But look, I just can't let that pass without saying, we left government in 2017, and the National Land Transport Fund priorities changed, and a bunch of extremely sensible projects were put on the back burner. And I know that all too well because it happened in my patch and with the Melling Interchange, which got pushed out to 2028. And the Tauranga Northern Link was, I feel like we're in deja vu because we had this argument last time, for those of you who are in the room. The Tauranga Northern Link was out for procurement. It was about to start. And the project was sliced because the pipeline was obliterated by those funding cuts to the state highway network. And then what ended up happening is communities rebelled. Grant Robertson went out and borrowed $10 billion, and that's how we got the New Zealand Upgrade Program, which has backfilled the National Land Transport Fund with essentially borrowed money. They're sensible projects, but we've had 5 years of kind of going around the bicycle sheds to get them done. So Yeah, well, we're sort of up for bipartisanship, but it's, it seems like it's being extended to us, and we're meant to sign up to a bunch of projects we don't necessarily support when when the shoe was on the other foot didn't happen. So I don't know, maybe that's a bit churlish, but
Yeah, just before I get to the audience questions, and they are coming in, if we could just spend just a few moments on decarbonisation and how you see that as a priority, and decarbonisation of the fleets, and how you would prioritise around that.
Yeah, well, can I? Well, you start. You're wearing the green tie. You go first.
Thanks, Wish. I mean, we're seeing this this change, and when we look at the Clean Car Standards, that's an incredible move to clean up our fleet for some of the dirtiest cars in Aotearoa. But when I look across our announcement and work over years actually in the cost to public transport, and we look across the COVID period, and government covered the majority of public transport. We've moved now into half-price public transport, and then Budget 2023, prioritises our kids and, of course, our under-24s for half-price. That's something that I think that we should continue. It does change behaviour, but we do need to be sensible, I guess, around where our best investment is. We need a bob each way at the moment, to be fair. Part of that is making public transport cheaper for patrons. The other part is we've got to continuously look at ways to invest back in our infrastructure and to accelerate the builds that we need. Some of that will come through government funding. Some of it needs to be raised by other means like tolls, and then other tools such as congestion pricing are a priority of that. But that does help us reduce our emissions overall.
I'm actually incredibly excited about the opportunity for New Zealand to decarbonise via transport. I think of our electrified train network, which we can do more with. I think of electric buses, but mainly I think of electric cars. And we've got a policy around this. It's called Electrify New Zealand. Our aim is to double New Zealand's renewable electricity generation by 2050. We have, Ricardo talked about comparative advantage. Our comparative advantage is cheap, renewable, clean energy. That's the reality. 85% of our electricity is renewable. Geothermal, wind, water, solar now is increasingly economic in New Zealand. Those are all the next cabs off the rank. We have abundant renewable energy. All we need to do is use it. And, successive reports from the Infrastructure Commission, Transpower, think of an expert, you name it. They say that the consenting framework is what holds us back. Why does it take 7 years to consent a wind farm? It takes 2 years to build it. It's nuts. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and many of the people in this room will know it, consenting stuff that's going to get built. And we just need to make it much easier to build the renewable projects we need, and that will drive the mass electrification of the economy. It's actually an incredibly exciting vision for New Zealand. We can drive electric cars, we can take electric buses. Fonterra can go off coal boilers, our schools can go off coal boilers. We can massively electrify the New Zealand economy and grow it at the same time and decarbonise. It's an incredibly exciting vision, and we are almost uniquely placed in the world to achieve that. We've just got to create the planning and consenting system to go out there and do it. But the Greens have got this view of the world. They're not here, so I'll just quietly defame them.
You missed Julianne.
But I'm on a panel with Julianne tomorrow, so come back for round 2. The Greens have got this view of the world, I think, at their harder extreme, to be fair. Maybe not Julianne, but the harder edge of them say, we've all got to go vegan and depopulate, and we can't grow and have babies and all the rest of it.
I hope there's no vegans in the room.
Yeah. Well, but there's a degree of that. And actually, the truth's the opposite. We can grow the economy, lift our living standards, and decarbonise all at the same time. And it's an incredibly exciting vision. We just got to get out there and do it.
And the reality is we're getting on and doing that. Under our government, we've done more in that area than we have ever done before. But, you can't talk about electrifying our vehicles and then not support certain policies like Clean Car Standards.
Well,
like that's the imbalance that where politics gets in the way.
No,
the reality is Clean Car Standards is one of the most successful tools and initiatives that we've had in this country for the most dirtiest cars that we've experienced in the world.
So there's a couple of things. There's a number of different policies here that interact and relate. We should have cleaner car standards. We support that as long as they're done in a sensible way in conjunction with industry.
That's the woulda, coulda, shoulda though.
Well, we campaigned in 2020 on a clean car standard, and we support one now. We do
Okay.
not support subsidies for Tesla owners. That is a waste of government money. People who buy Teslas should not receive discounts paid for by people who drive utes. That is an inefficient use of money. And we also do not support corporate welfare for BlueScope Steel, which made $1.3 billion last year, to decarbonise.
Not transport. Let's move back to
Sure,
it.
but it goes to
Okay.
the principles about
All right,
decarbonisation.
we've got some questions from the floor, and if we can just get through as many as we can
Yeah.
and address them quickly. Just one on decarbonisation, and someone has said, one for you quickly, Chris.
Yep.
How's national planning to decarbonise if it wants to build more roads and stop housing intensification? This problem you face.
Well, we are in favour of housing densification, and we are also in favour of greenfields. We are in favour of housing choice because we want to build competitive urban land markets that drive down the cost of land, particularly at Auckland's urban fringes and Wellington and Tauranga and other cities. The problem at the moment is the average square metre of land inside the city limit is $1,300 a square metre and is essentially nothing outside the city limit. All of that suffuses its way into the Auckland land market, and those are just artificially inflated values by government fiat. So we are smashing urban limits. And by the way, this was the
it's
policy.
really about putting more cars on the road. It's
No,
actually
no, no, no,
chewing
no, no,
up-
no, because the greenfields growth will have to be paid for if it's economically efficient, because we've put a policy rule in place that says that existing ratepayers cannot cross-subsidise the infrastructure required for new greenfields.
Yeah, basically what the question is getting at though
Yeah.
is actually decarbonising.
Yeah,
and if you're
there
going
will.
further
So there will
out,
be.
you're going to burn
Yeah,
more
there
carbon.
will be. No, well, so hang on. So there will be more density under our plans. That's the reality. That's a good thing. Secondly, electric cars go on roads. So we will be building more roads that electric cars will go on.
Okay,
The
all right.
fundamental problem is we don't have any more room in Auckland to build any more roads.
No, that's not true.
The model that they've put up is far more expensive because it pushes infrastructure that either doesn't currently exist or takes the focus away from intensified areas where, because of the population growth that is there, it's actually cheaper to build the quality infrastructure that we need.
Our policy is Phil Twyford's from 2017 minus the dumb stuff about Kiwi Build.
Before,
That's our
before,
policy.
before my time.
Moving on. That
our
was the
policy.
last election.
Before my time.
That's our policy.
Okay, both. In the interest of being efficient with overheads, capital and regulation, is there an appetite to combine road and rail, that is land transport, into a single entity?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My very short answer, and probably well above my pay grade, is that we continuously have to look at alternative ways of doing things. One for the cost perspective, how we can do it more efficiently than ever before, but also that we can achieve the multi-mode approach that we actually need. Quite often we're called out around not being supportive enough of roads and of cars. Certainly, I'm a car driver. We've got to ensure that people have alternative options to their car in order to get to where they want to go.
Just read the question again, friend.
Yep. In the interests of being efficient with overheads, capital and regulation, is there appetite to combine road and rail, that is land transport, into a single entity?
Yeah, well, that's kind of happening with the changes to track user charges through into NZTA. So there's a bit of that happening to some extent. I suppose my general comment would be rail definitely has a place in New Zealand. I mean, the Wellington region would not function without it. Likewise in Auckland. I'm a bit more sceptical about interregional rail. I'm looking forward to the report. But the economics of interregional rail are challenging, and the economics of freight on the rail system, with the exception of the Auckland, Tauranga, Hamilton, Golden Triangle, and some parts of the Lower North Island, are challenging. And so it's always about that next dollar of investment and where it goes. And I think there's going to be a lot of money directed to the rail network in the Golden Triangle in the next 20 years, and that's all going to make sense. Napier Wairoa, probably a bit less sensible. So it's about where that next dollar can go to create those benefits.
Yeah, perhaps here a question to both of you. Thanks for all the comments about Auckland, but what are you going to do about increasing capacity within our state highways outside of Auckland? Perhaps starting with you, Shannon.
So one of the priority areas, of course, is the $6 billion investment that we've put into the Resilience Fund post Cyclone Gabrielle. That's now sitting with regional councils to determine what their priorities are. And that's where I think the partnership needs to be around supporting localised solutions. That could include our main highways. We've certainly invested in those over our time in government. Whether there needs to be further investment, that can be a discussion point. But I go back to my original point. We need to ensure that we are equitably investing in our transport networks, and that includes our main highways.
Also a question about why aren't we talking about electrifying freight by taking it off the road and onto a sustainable rail network?
Well, I think we are, and I think that's happening, and that's why sensible, prudent investment in the rail network to allow that to happen makes sense. Is why we need to continue electrifying the network, for example. That's just going to be, I think, probably a progressive program of work over the next 10 to 15, 20 years. That makes sense, particularly, as I say, in the Golden Triangle. Just on the roading network, look, I think there's more to do. I mean, the obvious ones to me, I'm not announcing our policies, but the obvious ones to me are State Highway 29 outside Tauranga, new greenfields housing development, 40,000 homes, give or take, connects into that triangle, the Golden Triangle. And then the obvious other one is further north. I mean, Northland is held back by a completely suboptimal and deficient roading network from Auckland to Northland. We got quite a lot of grief. This is before Shannon's time, so I'm not having a go at him, but we used to get quite a lot of grief for the Holiday Highway, which is the 4-laning north of Auckland. I notice no one really talks about that anymore, because I think the thing that's holding Northland's economy back is the lack of good roading network to Auckland. And so I think, we're going to have to progressively expand the road network there.
Just before we come back to questions, I mean, one of the issues is obviously Cyclone Gabrielle. And how do you both think issues like the Coromandel can be addressed, where it's been washed out many times, many of those roads in recent months? Someone in today's supplement, Brett O'Reilly, has suggested there and other places you could build a highway actually around the coast rather than through areas which are more susceptible to slippages, but of course might not go down quite so well with the people who own the batches and that. But I mean, do we have to make some hard calls for some of these areas?
I certainly think that we do. I grew up in Hawke's Bay, a lot of family in Wairoa, and those coastal towns that have one way in, one way out, and when we experience weather events like we did, they completely get washed out. Not only is that a concern for people trying to get to work or whatever, but there's actually the access to the resources, the food that they need. So we do need to be more sensible. That's going to take quite a planned approach. The integration and partnership with local body councils is incredibly important in those regions, and leadership, I suspect, is an important thing.
Yeah, look, I don't have much more to add. I agree. I mean, the first priority has got to be the rebuild of the East Coast and the Hawke's Bay, and I think there's no politics in that. They've been through a traumatic event, and look, we'll just work our way through that with those local communities. I hadn't seen Brett's comments. I'll go and have a read of that. That sounds interesting. Sounds expensive, but let's have a look.
Yeah. Just sort of staying on those issues, I mean, how do you see the priorities with this huge problems we have faced this year? I mean, just give us a bit more of the flavour of what governments sitting outside of your own party perspective actually have to confront now. I mean, it seems to be very big problems, very big issues.
Very existential question, Fran.
Well, I can do them.
I think of that period of time, right? And my mum was without power and communication for over a week. That is not the future that we want to live in. And whether that's about a telecommunications tower, whether it's a road going into those rural areas, whether it's about the rebuild coming out of it, it comes back to equity. And when we think about Auckland, and I talk a lot more about Auckland because that's where I'm from, but I equally look to the provinces to go, actually, from an equitable lens, how should they have access to quality transport where they get to, they too get to move around as they want, but they also are able to start a pathway forward about reducing their emissions.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a tough few years for the country, right? And I think a lot of people are tired, actually, and pretty exhausted. The challenge is that, by definition, you can't overbuild for everything. So you can build latency into the system, but events happen and they'll knock out networks. And that's partly what happened in Auckland. I'm not saying we couldn't have done a better job to build resilience, but at some level, there's a level of event in which you just can't plan for. Christchurch earthquake's a classic example. So the challenge is always making the funding envelope fit what you've got in front of you. And I suppose what we're saying this morning is that, and I think this would be a difference between National and Labour, is I think we're more open to the use of private capital to redress the funding deficit than maybe Labour has been in the last few years. Because I think our general view would be central government can't do it all by itself, and neither can local government actually. We need all hands on deck and we need all sources of capital, and we just got to find the funding streams and the right structures and vehicles to make that work. And so, yeah.
I think you both agree that it's a fairly large quantum of money and required in the next few years, and perhaps a more flexible approach to how private sector capital might be used as well, and also obviously congestion charging, which has been around as an issue for at least 10 years, if not more. We are very slow, however, to move to some of these concepts. Do you both feel confident we can get on top of the infrastructure challenge ahead of us?
I certainly think that we're on the right track. I have some concern at the moment that with the election, I think of some of the uncertainty through local government, or particularly through Auckland Council at the moment. It's problematic to us all getting on the same page to agree on what those priorities are and to get on with the job. I heard quite clearly over lunch that we want to be a global city in Auckland. We want quality transport infrastructure. That does come at a cost. And my concern is around how do we measure how much is too much investment? How do we find that right balance between what the public wants, which is right here, right now, to change the transport that is in front of them getting to A to B? But how do we, most of all, identify and get on with the projects that are a priority? Some of that isn't always, and I see people in the room, some of those projects aren't always popular. And so that's the bravery and leadership that is required.
A very quick closing comment from you, because time is up.
Yeah, I can see that it's flashing in front of me. Yeah, look, I actually am very optimistic about the future. Auckland should be a great international city, and it can be. And actually, a lot has changed in the last 10, 12 years that I've been around politics. I think the CRL will be transformational. I think there's a lot more we can do around rapid transit, and I also think there's a lot more we can do around intensification around rapid transit and mixed-use zoning and things like that, which we haven't talked about, but is really important. I think Auckland can be our great international city, and I love Auckland, and I want to make it fly. I also want to fix Wellington, by the way, which we haven't talked about.
Poor Wellington. Sorry to the Wellingtonians.
But I'm very optimistic.
Thank you both very much. I think it's been a very adult conversation, not too much biffo, which I think this audience really appreciates.
You come back for Julianne tomorrow.
So look, do please
kidding.
thank them very much. Thank you. Thank you both.